welcome and good afternoon to everybody. This is the second in our series of podcasts, and today's podcast focuses on cybersecurity and data privacy. But we'll also be talking about data security, as I've learned from Dan's great book, Reached, that it's same, but not really quite the same. So there are important differences. The format will be a fireside chat. We'll be taking questions throughout, so please feel free to use the Q&A function. I'll just briefly introduce the folks on the panel today, but you have their full bios in the materials. So we have Michael Bramnick, who is the head of administration and a member of the executive team at NRG, a leading integrated power company. We have Charisse Castagnoli, who is the founder of Villia, I should say, a boutique security consulting firm specializing in ACH, wire fraud, and risk management, and a co-founder of, I had actually to take a double look at the Cypher Queens, I think is how you pronounce it, right? Empowering Women in Security. We have Trent Jager, who is professor in the Computer Science and Engineering Department at Penn State University and co-director of the Systems and Internet Infrastructure Security Lab. We have Christy Scott Lane, who is the Central Intelligence Agency's Privacy and Civil Liberties Officer. In that role, she is an independent primary advisor to the CIA Director and other agency officials to ensure that privacy and civil liberties are integrated into the day-to-day conduct of the agency's mission. We have Dan Soloff, John Marshall Harlan Research Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School, founder of Teach Privacy, a privacy and cybersecurity training company, and an author of a book that we are going to be discussing afterwards as well. And last but not least, we have Jack Stryker, who is associate with Mullen Coughlin. Jack practices primarily in the firm's incident response practice area and counsels organizations who have been the victim of a data privacy and cybersecurity incident. So let's start with Dan and the book that I just referenced. Now, in the book, you say, let's not focus on the breach. The breach is often what people think about. Why shouldn't people focus on the breach, and what should we focus on instead?
So the law has really become obsessed with the breach. And typically what happens is that a organization has a breach, and then the law seeks to deal a lot of pain to that organization. The organization will face civil liability. The regulators will start piling in and investigating and issuing fines. This is problematic in a number of ways. First, because it's very reactive. It happens after the breach, and it seeks to add additional pain to the breach in the hopes that somehow this is going to deter or stop breaches, but it doesn't really. I mean, at the end of the day, it adds marginally to the pain that an organization feels, but not a lot. I mean, ultimately, they're going to be suffering tremendous losses and costs that are far beyond the particular fine by the regulators. So it's not really, I think, making a material difference in terms of deterrence. It just, it's kicking a horse that's already dying. And then I think what is the biggest missed opportunity or the biggest thing that the law is failing to do is that it's just focusing on what is essentially the last chapter of a very long novel, and that's the breach. But a lot of things contribute to breaches that occur long before the breach happens. And there are a lot of other actors that are involved in creating a breach. It takes a village to create a breach. And the law actually is very bad about punishing those particular actors, about doing things to deter them from the things they do to contribute to the breach. It's not holding them accountable. And there's just so much you can do to push the organizations to get better. I think, yes, they can do better on security. Almost every breach I've studied, the organization could probably have done something a little bit better. And in some cases, they actually were pretty bad on security. So we certainly can improve it. But at the end of the day, there's just so much we can improve by just pushing on this one type of actor. And we need to start thinking about breaches more holistically and looking at breaches as for all the actors that are contributing to the breach. And that could be, manufacturers of buggy software and vulnerable devices. It's companies that are miseducating people by doing things that almost teach people to fall for phishing tricks, like send emails that look just like the emails a spammer would send, a hacker would send. There are actors that exploit vulnerabilities rather than report them. The government is guilty of this a lot of times. And I can go on, but there's a lot of actors that if we start holding them more accountable, we could really start making some greater inroads in addressing breaches. But unfortunately, the law is just obsessed with the breach and seems to just focus mostly on the organizations that have a breach. But I just don't think that alone is just not effective.
One of the things that you talk about is misaligned market incentives. So, and I see folks already nodding on this call. So why are we missing the point in market incentives? Is it then a question of using the law in a more creative way, or is the law even the solution to this?
Well, it's not the only solution. I think there are a lot of things that the law can do that it's not doing. And typically what the law does is, well, it will provide for breach notification, which I think is generally, it's an okay thing. It's not a bad thing, but it's not a cure. It's not a vaccine. It's just a notice. It sheds some light on the problem, which is good, but it actually doesn't solve it. And so legislatures are, well, oh my gosh, there are more breaches, so let's just shorten the deadlines of reporting, which is getting to a point of being ridiculous, because no one really knows what's going on in the within a few hours of a breach. But they increasingly shorten the deadlines, but that's not effective, I think, in stopping breaches. And if we really want to get to a point where we want to curtail breaches, we need to address the things differently. The other thing too is it's sort of wrong to view that security is all about preventing all breaches. It's not. In fact, it's about a risk balance. And we can't have perfect security. We don't want perfect security. We want a good balance. And ultimately, though, the law can help, though, by making breaches hurt less. It can actually take some of the injury out of breaches by certain things that the law can do. So there's a lot of things that the law can do and work on different actors to hold them accountable, which could really start having, I think, a much greater effect on breaches. And that does work through incentives. If other parties are not held accountable for the role they play, and they can just do what they do with impunity, then they're going to keep doing that. And that's going to keep contributing to the breach until that's cracked down on.
Thanks, Dan. I want to invite folks on the panel to weigh in. A number of you had talked about how focusing on the breach is in fact the wrong issue. But you take it from a different perspective. We've got folks from government, we've got folks from academia, from in-house. How do you see this issue where you are? Yeah, Trent, go ahead.
Sure.
And you can either unmute yourself or you can raise your virtual hand. However, we are informal here. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Daryl. I guess I've been looking, trying to gather information related to how we might consider, software security in the context of the law, by looking a little bit at other industries like the automobile industry and bridge building, and I guess airlines might be another. And it seems like a lot of the stories that I've found so far are sort of breach oriented, but in that industry, a bridge fails, there's a car accident where there's some bad effect or airline incident. And of course, there are many parties that may contribute to the creation of the thing that ultimately failed, that led to effectively a breach in that context. But often, the focus is on, the last mile, hey, this, General Motors built this car, or, Boeing built this plane, despite all of the other parties that may have contributed to putting that together. Are there parallels that we can draw from that experience, do you think, that may help us get away from this, sort of unreasonable breach-oriented perspective? Do you think, Dan?
Hold on, Cherise raised her hand. Are you answering Trent's question?
Yeah, I want to jump in on his questions really quickly. I think your analogy about looking at other industries and look at how we manage risk in those other industries is really interesting. And this actually ties back into Dan's point about misaligned in incentives. In the area that I work in, data breach in ACH wire fraud, we are running the majority of our financial infrastructure on APIs that are probably older than the software in the space shuttle. And because of that, and because of the lack of, the lack of transparency and accountability in that underlying financial system, we've created an opportunity where, regardless of how good your software is, or how good your training is, or how good, somebody is always going to be able to leverage that and migrate cash to an extra jurisdictional location where it's very difficult to recover. So from a software and alignment perspective, I think the third actor in here really is entrenched industries that have, and it's not easy. I'm not saying this is easy, right? It's not easy to go rip out SWIFT and rip out our underlying international transfers, but we do have new techniques and tools. I hate to say it, but blockchain would be a great way to do international money transfers compared to what we do today. So I don't think it's just, I think we know what we need to do, but there's this inertia in the core, in my opinion, one of the underlying mechanisms utilized by threat actors. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say later on the economics of threat actors, Jack, because we enable this by being unwilling to identify modalities that could be implemented. And again, international change is not easy, but we certainly do it. We've done it with GDPR. I think we could do it in the financial system.
I want to ask Christy this question now, because you give me a segue to talk about international change. And just very recently, President Biden signed an executive order to implement the European Union US data transfer framework. And in fact, we have the point person who is in charge of that. It addresses concerns that the Court of Justice of the EU has struck down prior US Privacy Shield framework as a valid data transfer mechanism under US law, basically concerned that their citizens' data will be compromised. Where are we now with this, Christy? And what should we need to know about this new development?
Yeah, I think, and as you noted, on 7 October, President Biden did sign an executive order that rescinded in part sections of PPD 28, which was the prior presidential policy directive 28, that provided certain protections for all individuals, irrespective of their nationality, and was part and parcel of the Schrems 2 invalidation that we saw last August. Can't remember if it's 2 Augusts ago, but really I think is a sea change with respect to the national security implications that are behind the scenes of some of this commercial sector movement, and underpinning really, I think, to a large degree, some of the cybersecurity efforts in the space, to include Executive Order 14023, which is improving the nation's cybersecurity executive order and really the establishment of a national cyber director within the White House. Sort of one of the things I think is important to note is the sort of string between the commercial sector and the federal privacy community, as well as the federal government writ large. And I think the OPM breach is a good example of really showing on full display the potential for deleterious effects on the national security as a result of some of the breaches that occur in the private sector. So I think we're all in this together. It is sort of, one observation that I take, and that there are a set of interdependent factors that affect us all. The government, in this respect, has long paid attention to what we call the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014, or FISMA, for those that are more familiar with it. And it's really a set of guidance and rules and controls that seek to nip in the bud some of that focus on the actual breach, but look at some of the mechanics behind the scenes in terms of making sure the federal government has good hygiene practices, access, audit controls. And I think, as Michael noted earlier, we're only as good as our weakest link. And so we've got to go to a great length to make sure that folks are trained, that they understand the threat landscape, and it's multidimensional for sure. But Professor Solov is absolutely right. We are focused greatly on sort of the breach, but not some of these other modalities that are the underlying cause of the actual breach.
Thank you. Now, one of the things that Dan talks about in his book is the social security number issue. And he's basically saying that the law sometimes creates problems. Yes, there is that human actor, and we'll talk about how we might fix that in a moment, but there's also the legal causation of it. And I'm not going to attempt to paraphrase you, Dan, since you are here to paraphrase yourself. But how would you describe the crux of the social security number problem? And what might the solution be?
Well, this is the problem of the law's creation. So, the law created the social security number, and it created it for a particular purpose, which was to allow for the creation of social security accounts and prevent people's names from being confused. So if someone had the same name or two people had very similar names, the social security number was a way to make sure that the money and the appropriate information got into the appropriate account. And it works very well for that purpose. However, with the rise of computers and the increased use of data by the government as well as by the private sector, the use of the social security number became very handy for other uses. And eventually the private sector started using the social security number to authenticate identity. And this is a big no-no. This is, I think, a terrible practice, which is to use a social security number as a way to figure out if you're you. And the way it works is, well, do you know, what's your social security number? And if you know it, then you must be you. Now, this is basically using the social security number as a password. And this is a terrible use for it. It's an awful password because social security numbers are readily available. They're often involved in breaches. You can actually buy people's social security numbers from database companies. This is an awful password, but it's used all the time as a convenient way to authenticate people. And so the law has created this problem. And so then when a breach happens and social security numbers are exposed, that then creates a risk because the social security number can be used to unlock accounts or to open up accounts in people's names. Now, here's where the law could actually do some good and fix it. If the law were, and at one point during the Privacy Act of 1974, there was a provision to restrict the use of social security numbers by the private sector, and that got stripped out of the law. So in essence, the government has created the number and forced everyone to have this number and then not done anything to regulate the downstream uses of the number, which have gotten, I think, quite irresponsible. So I think the answer here is, restrict the use of social security numbers for authentication. And actually, there's the authority already. The FTC has this ability already in its law, because under a number of laws, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, as well as other laws, as well as just general Section 5 of the FTC Act, which covers a very broad range of commercial activity, I think the use of social security numbers to authenticate identity is unreasonable. It's an unreasonable security practice. No one would say that's a reasonable use of it as a password. So the FTC could easily, bring enforcement actions against any kind of use of that. And if we stamp out the use of social security numbers in this wrong way, then a breach of social security numbers doesn't cause as much harm.
Professor Solum, I have one question for you. So, as someone who was a student of the Privacy Act of 1974 as amended 2018, if you and do away with the use of social security numbers, which I think, the federal government has made various attempts to do that, whether it's through OMB, White House policy guidance and memoranda, et cetera. Does that incentivize the use of biometrics, right? We saw this recently with the IRS using technology for facial recognition, other sorts of biometrics. And then we saw that being questioned by the Hill to say, no, we weren't sure what you were up to, IRS. Now you're collecting this facial recognition of individual taxpayers. We have no idea where that information is going. Does the reduction of the use of social security numbers, which is tied to a financial harm, therefore incentivize the use of biometrics or other sorts of PII that may be more concerning?
Well, I guess then the argument, I would say, yes, it does lead to that. But I guess I would say, if your kid is, playing with fire and you say, stop playing with fire, and then they go off and play with something else dangerous, then I don't think the answer is, well, just let them play with fire. I would say the answer is, yes, we should regulate the heck out of biometrics, and the law is way behind on that. It needs to do a lot more. I think that we're putting biometrics in largely unprotected in a lot of cases that companies are using and giving it data security that we know is not adequate. And then the problem is, if that gets out, if those are compromised, you can't put that back in the bottle. So it's really dangerous. So I get that, but I think we're already moving there. And in typical fashion, the way that we do things in the law is that, pretty much, things get used, things happen, and then they're let to spiral out of control until things get just absolutely ridiculously, impossibly awful. And then finally, someone said, well, maybe we should do a little regulation here. It'd be nice to regulate. We know the problems, and we can regulate now. But I still think, the social security number is a problem. It is an antiquated way to authenticate identity. It is bad, and we should stamp it out. But definitely, we need to be thinking about, not letting companies just move on to something else that's incredibly dangerous.
This is clearly a hot topic issue. I saw Sharice raise a virtual hand. We already have a question from the audience. I'm going to invite after that Jack and Michael to weigh in if they have any thoughts. So Sharice,
I just want to say a couple of things about SSNs. Number one, it is not allowed to be used as an identifier in many industries now. That's part of HIPAA. It's many state laws coming from Texas, which has both an SSN notification and a biometrics law. I think the states are stepping in some of these ways. I'd ask our colleague at the CIA, I'm PKCS 12, I think, did a very effective use of biometric authentication in the CAC-PIV card. Sorry, these are technical terms, I apologize. This is an identity card that's used throughout the federal government and has been in use for many, many years. And if you ask an NSA professional, when was the last time they changed their password? They'll say never. Why? Because they don't use it. So authentication, and to the audience question, authentication is a challenge, right? We need to be, as we're remote and distributed, we need to have some methodology for authentication. SSNs absolutely should not be used, and we need to educate the population that when someone asks you, when Verizon asks you for your social security number, you say, no, you're not entitled to it. You can't have it, and I know one in your database. And this is a personal liberties right that exists today. Only people who report on taxes can ask you for your SSN. That's just not generally known. I don't know why. It's been the law for a long time. So back to the authentication methodology, I want to ask Trent and Dan, what we see in, zero trust environments and passwordless authentication modalities is a migration to biometrics, but it's predominantly using consumer devices. Again, unregulated, not potentially as well tested as a CAC-PIV card is. How can we either train the engineers to put the effort into making these biometric data elements much less reusable? And how can we, Dan, incentivize, to your point, incentivize the proper utilization of biometric authentication? We look at the work done with the Face ID program, just using public data, scraping off of LinkedIn and Facebook, and the incredible accuracy, aside from certain, data population issues of gender and ethnicity. That was all done with publicly available data. So how can we move in that direction? And how can we educate the population not to give up their SSNs?
You want to go, Dan, or so in our security classes, we teach SSNs as one example of a terrible authentication entity to students. But getting to biometrics, the security community, computer science research community in security is not very interested in biometrics, doesn't find these to be the right kind of authenticator. The main problem with biometrics, and people have kind of been alluding to it, is that, hey, this is another secret value like your SSN that, you're going to have to give up to get access. And if you give it up, then the party that receives it has it, and they can use it. And the problem then, and I don't want to get too morbid, but, we talk also about, if you have a password or a secret that uses authentication and it's not any good anymore, you revoke that certificate. And biometrics are obviously not a very easily revocable, piece of information. And so the security community, again, going back a long ways, was hoping that people would have some more, public key, cryptographically based information that they could provide, perhaps through a smart card going way back, that people haven't talked about in like 20 years, seems like, that has a, strong cryptographic key, and that this is, preserved on this device. But there have been studies that people have done about, the use of cryptographic material for authentication, and there are a lot of challenges right now. We were talking about the breaches where, we might want to attack, company A and steal, their private key and be able to act and do malicious things in that company. But if all of us have private keys, then we all become, all of us become targets for stealing that. And that may be better ultimately than what we're doing now, but it's still to the research community, a big challenge. And in practice, it'll become a difficult challenge. And then there are various, freedom I don't want to carry around, some kind of, personal identifier and this sort of thing. We've accepted SSNs. It's always, I think, a challenge to bring in new kinds of identifying information for people. Biometrics, I guess, are easy because you can't escape that, but there are fundamental problems with biometrics technically.
Thanks, Trent. Jack, what can you tell us about threat actors?
Sure, thank you. I guess coming off of what Trent just said, identity management is a big piece of cybersecurity. And I'm not super interested in biometrics because there are always going to be ways to work around that, and a machine won't know if it's you or if it's not you. If they find a way to, if a threat actor finds a way to credential itself into a system, then they're doing valid tasks, they're using valid tools, there's no software bugs. Credential theft is what I mostly see in the field, and I did computer security for 10 years before law school, and I do incident response now. I'm still seeing a lot of the same thing. If your VPN credentials are harvested, then you've just created a nice secure tunnel for a threat actor to access all of your critical assets. People think that a VPN is sort of going to solve their problems. There's no silver bullet in computer security. So I agree with everything that's been said as far as the focus being too heavy on the breach itself. And one of the systemic infrastructure issues I wanted to just give you guys some insight to, because I don't think this is very well understood, is I just want to bring up ransomware. What I mostly see is business email compromises and ransomware. Those are the two, and wire fraud. I'm sure it's definitely that too. Ransomware is something that makes a lot of headlines. People talk about it a lot. It's devastating for a business. Software companies are selling software as a service, right? You license it for a certain amount of time, a certain level to use the software. You don't have to be a software engineer to use software as a service. And ransomware used by threat actors is also ransomware as a service. So most threat actors are not engineers out there doing all of this like crazy code. There are user guides and training manuals, and software as a service is either subscription-based or profit sharing.
And tech support.
And there's tech support, yes, there's customer service, there are call centers, there are affiliates, and the way that those relationships work are that there are some affiliates that only run botnets. Botnets are, robot networks is what that stands for, that just crawl through the internet, harvesting credentials. And once user level credentials are harvested, threat actors traverse laterally through a network until they find administrator level credentials or administrator equivalents. That's called privilege creep, fascinating. And then they can escalate vertically to more critical assets like domain admin level credentials. So there's the affiliate that has the botnets. They sell credentials to a broker. The broker looks up public records of a company and says, this company, it has 400 endpoints, it's worth $100 million. They auction those credentials to different threat groups who are using malware, that's ransomware, that they are licensed or in the profit sharing model with. And then the deployment is like 2 lines of code. It's not very complex. But because there are vulnerabilities in systems and valid credentials are being used, your antivirus is not going to detect this. Or a threat actor can just modify the settings of your antivirus and they're logging in as you, so it doesn't, raise any flags. So like, for instance, Conti is one of the largest and most successful threat actors in the last few years. They have an org chart. They have call centers that are clearly people who are just doing a job. Some of the voicemails that my clients get when they are being sort of extorted on the back end after they've already recovered from the ransomware, they've done their data privacy due diligence and notified everyone they need to. They've gone through regulatory inquiries, everything else. I get these, my clients get these voicemails that it's just someone reading a script. It could be the receptionist at a dentist saying, hello, this is Hive Group. If you don't pay us $4 million, we will, profanity. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. I mean, it's just so surreal. So I'm telling you guys all this background because the common understanding, it seems, is that when we talk about threat actors, we are talking about some lone wolf in their parents' basement. And this is sophisticated organized crime. We see persistent nation state adversaries. I'm sure Christy knows exactly what I'm talking about. And there is a huge delta. I know that the law has to be a blunt instrument, but there is just such a huge delta between the risk level and especially businesses' understanding of that risk level and the decision makers in businesses that are talking about cybersecurity and the actual threat models that we see. So, you know, I think that part of the inertia that Sharice, you mentioned earlier might have something to do with that delta and that lack of maybe understanding, or maybe it's, I don't know what it is, but that's one of the issues that I see. And it's not just ransomware, it's ransomware as a service, it's big business.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Michael, I want to bring you in. Jack talked about the business model. Is this something that you think about? Does it keep you up at night?
It does. And I will tell you, Daryl, that as the I'm probably the least informed person on this panel. But, you know, part of my challenge, you know, we are a Fortune 200 company. We have thousands of employees. Part of my challenge as Chief Compliance Officer, which is one of the hats that I wear, is trying to take the information that you've been hearing from these incredibly intelligent panelists and then making them tangible to employees who are just trying to, you know, finish out their job and book the latest journal entry, or to board members, frankly, who are trying to fulfill their obligations under Delaware law. And so, you know, we try to do that and make this as tangible as possible. And I'll give you a couple examples. You know, one of the Social Security number discussion brought to mind our change in passwords. I think we present twice a year to the board on cybersecurity. We also have an interdisciplinary committee on cybersecurity at the management level that meets, you know, quarterly. One, you know, piece of advice is please don't silo cybersecurity in your very well-intentioned IT group. There are elements of, you know, corporate compliance, cash management, corporate security, internal audit. There are all sorts of elements, let alone human resources or what we call talent at our company. But, you know, we moved from after a presentation about how easy and how very small amount of time it takes to hack a 8 element password, we moved to 12 element passwords. But that simple amount of information, that making it tangible for an employee that it takes hours versus years to hack those 2 different types of passwords, you are more, you know, likely to get buy-in from employees and go through the pain of trying to remember a 12 element password. But training is absolutely critical. I think Jack and maybe Christy said it before, you know, you're looking for your most vulnerable element. Well, look, we spend a lot of money on cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, but the most dangerous element is the employee themselves. Responding, you know, it's a young mom or dad maybe around the holidays who's just trying to make sure an Amazon delivery gets through to, you know, to a grandparent, and they click on an email because they use their work email for, you know, for some sort of Amazon delivery. So we do training, you know, regularly for employees. We report on that training, not just to the employees, but to the board and to management. If an employee continues to click on links they shouldn't click on, frankly, they get disciplined. They get a talk from their manager because we need people to be vigilant. I think Jack said, you know, you're never safe in just a virtual private network or any other, you know, sort of element. That's something we try to maintain during the training, that, look, we are going to try to come at this from 18 different ways because it changes all the time.
Michael, I want to ask you a quick
sure.
question on training. In Dan's book, he says, and I'm channeling my inner Dan here, training becomes a waste dump for intricate security advice that only the most assiduous people will follow. The focus on making everything look good on paper is terrible in practice. Now, is there a disconnect between the well-intentioned training modules that companies have and what actually happens in practice?
All I can tell you is that we track in relatively real time how often people are actually clicking on links that they shouldn't be. Oftentimes those links are sent out by the IT security team, not necessarily by a threat actor. We report on that because it's the reporting that's critical. We report on that by function, by business line, and by manager. And so, Jack Stryker, who manages a team, within a particular business line, she's going to get a report that shows how many of her employees, how they did on the latest, training. So I think if you are training and reporting and the training continues to be different, that is the only way to address the human element, in addition to all the other ways like red hat testing and penetration testing and all the special ways that IT security has of protecting us via their bells and whistles. But we're trying to worry about the human element and do what we can to lock that down as much as humanly possible.
Thanks. Dan, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I definitely believe very strongly in training because it's another hat I wear. I have a training company and train a number of organizations. I do think the quality of the training matters. A lot of it's just a data dump to individuals and just throwing information about people and saying, hey, we told them is not effective. I do think we also demand the impossible of people. I mean, remembering these very long passwords and having a unique password for the hundreds, if not thousands of accounts that people have, and then sometimes, making people change them all the time. This is beyond human cognition. I mean, it's just not possible. And so basically, we demand the impossible of people with passwords, and then we blame them when we fail. Then when we have people, with a password on a sticky note, or when people select bad passwords, we blame them. Well, it's beyond it's just not possible. So, a lot of the advice is not even feasible to actually do. And obviously we want to do it, but it has to be something that humans are capable of. The other thing is that there are other problems that are systemic problems. One is, the fact that, we focus a lot on authenticating the individual to organizations, but we do very little, and we have no real system to authenticate organizations to individuals. So it's like, oh, well, I have to somehow figure out as a consumer if this link is safe or not. Oh, is this a legitimate website? Is this a legitimate email? What should I do? And yes, it's true that a lot of the hackers are not good spellers, which is great, because they don't have to be. They even win when they're not good spellers, but if the sophisticated ones can trick, anyone can be tricked. At the end of the day, there is always a way you can trick people because, the average consumer is busy. They don't have time to, study the two things to see what is legit and what's not. And so ultimately they could fall for it. And in the more sophisticated attacks go after, folks with more sophisticated sets of login credentials.
I see Christy smiling, so I'm going to use that as a cue to bring her in. Dan is suggesting two-way authentication. Is that something which the government should introduce as an expectation for doing business?
Yeah, I think, and Charisse mentioned early some of the terms CAT cards and, two-factor authentication. But I think the training piece, as Professor Solov mentioned, you're usually getting folks at the end of the year, the holidays, they've got to do this required training. They just want to get through it. And so one of the approaches that we try to do, and if you're doing this, once a year, once a month training, it's not necessarily the most effective use of time. So we try to train people at multiple points in their career, right? Maybe when you start's a good point, but then you forget all that information when you actually get in your job and you have a user-based role. We try to change and incorporate training there. I mean, at the end of the day, people are humans, they're going to make mistakes. But I think to the degree that you can minimize the likelihood that folks are going to just click on a link, the training has to be often, early and often, and not necessarily one and done. And then also to the degree that you can implement signing rules of behavior, right? Because breaches are one thing, but then there are other aspects of the law and harms that we look at, whether it's embarrassment, that sort of harm that I think the fair information practice principles that underpin the Privacy Act really seek to draw out. It's not just financial harm. We certainly saw that with the Sony breach, right? If folks remember that, where you had high-level executives making disparaging comments, and in some cases racist comments about their workforce and others. And so I think it's, with respect to training, you've got to do it early and often, and depending on how people move about your company or organization. And then also thinking about cybersecurity harm as more than financial harm, because I think the harms, depending on the incident, the breach, or the systemic issues, can be much more significant, more so in some respects than the financial harm that these companies can experience.
Well, thanks. The other thing that came up, which I think is worth exploring more, is biometrics. So you say biometrics might be the better alternative to 8-element passwords, and certainly better than the social security number. And tech companies have implemented that, right? So you have Google doing that, you have TikTok and so on. But then they are also getting into trouble. Texas is suing Google, right, for saying they are implementing the Eye of Sauron, that is now capturing not just the person, but everybody that passes by that camera. And whenever you upload something onto one of these Google apps, a photograph, for example, of a birthday party, you're not just capturing the person who's in the picture that you want to capture, but everyone else as well. And all their biometrics are being captured, stored, and analyzed by these tech companies. So is the solution therefore worse than the problem that it purports to solve? Question to the panel. And Trent, if you have your hand up, you are welcome to take the first stab at it, if you like.
Yeah, I wanted to respond. I mean, as I said before, biometrics aren't a long-term authentication solution. I think, someone mentioned two-factor authentication. I think, two or multi or, choices, randomly chosen factors of authentication over time will be much, much better. I think this sort of gets back to what Charisse said at the beginning, where, we got used to using computers in a certain way, that there's a history, of how we do things. She was talking about the banking system, but I think here we're talking about, how users interact with computers. And there's going to need to be a significant retraining of users. And we're sort of very slowly evolving into that. But I don't know if, Michael has any thoughts on how quickly that process can evolve to something that maybe is less risky, because I think now we're still allowing users to make way too many high risk decisions, which I think Dan was getting at as well.
Michael?
It just really depends on where you are in the company. Users, you can't get too far in front of people depending upon what they do. We have 3 trade floors, for example. You can't have too much in front of an employee that prevents them from sort of doing their job efficiently and effectively. And that's the balance. I think that we probably err on the side of allowing them to do their job, but we have switched, I would say, over the last 18 months or so to keeping all the sort of things we're doing on affirmative training, things like that. But I think we do more stuff behind the scenes, the IT security team. So we're doing, we instituted a program to monitor any downloads to, for example, thumb drives and things like that. We're piloting some other types of things about accessing various types of files, and that'll send up a red flag somewhere. So I do think we try very hard not to prevent people from doing what they need to do, especially folks like, traders who are making decisions in, you know, split seconds. But it's not, there's no good answer here.
And then Cherise, for companies like Google and others who are basically stuck between a rock and a hard place, all right, is cybersecurity insurance the solution?
I don't think they can assure against that risk. At least I don't think there's an insurance company big enough to take that on. You know, we talk about, talking about, the human element here. It's ironic that we're still dealing with humans trying to write down passwords and generate their own passwords. I mean, there have been solutions for this for years and years and years. They're password generators, they keep track of things. I don't have a single password I share across that 1,400 different properties that I log into. It's all electronically done and unfortunately biometrically secured as my backup, but I don't store it in the cloud. I store it on a thumb drive, offloaded. But I'm an extreme example, right? I know what I'm doing and I wouldn't have a huge financial loss, but I've had a very big embarrassing loss if my credentials showed up on, the dark web. Actually, my LinkedIn credentials are in fact on the dark web. And the reason I know it was LinkedIn is because of the date and the password that they got, which fortunately was only used at LinkedIn. That was back in 2007. As long as I know, that's the last time my password was leaked, at least according to certain dark web metrics. So cyber insurance is interesting. It's a form of risk management, right? And if we think about risk generally, we look at, avoid, accept, transfer, or insure. The challenge with cyber insurance these days is it's expensive. We had a lot of people move into it from a market positioning, and then we had COVID. And what did COVID do? COVID just wide opened the door for ransomware and business email compromise mentioned earlier. And IC3, if those on the call don't know about it, it's ic3.org. It's monitors statistics. Anyone can file a complaint there about a financial loss associated with a cybersecurity incident. It's very, very useful. Their latest stats on 2021 were $2.4 billion in business email compromise. And sadly, I continue to see the same TTPs, tactic, techniques, and procedures being implemented year over year over year. I did my first ACH wire fraud case in 2006. I just saw the exact same TTP implemented against a small community.
Now, why is this, Cherise? Is that just that people aren't learning? Are they not getting the memo? What's going on there?
Not learning. If you are a small, medium business, if you're in healthcare, if you're in education, you have a big bullseye target planted on your back. Healthcare, they have to spend their money on medical assistance and medical supervising. They have a very low percentage of spend on IT. Same with schools. The money has to go to the students and to education, does not get spent on IT. It's the same things, they still work. Humans, as Professor Soloff mentioned, are very poor at parsing letters. We confuse, I'm dyslexic, I confuse everything. But we confuse an L and a 1. We confuse a B and a D. We confuse an S and another S. Humans are very, very, very poor at identifying small changes in a descriptive term that you're relying on to, as we say, authenticate, right? So cyber insurance, was one way organizations could at least manage or attempt to manage some of their risk associated with this, at least in terms of the economic costs. But it has tripled in price year over year. And yes, I see nods. And you can't even get the policy that you may want anymore. They're just too expensive, and they're too expensive because there have been a lot of payouts. So what happens when there's payouts? The legal community, we try to avoid paying. And that has also led to some really interesting law. And if it's okay, I'll just jump into a couple of things that I think might be somewhat interesting for the group, but shut me up if you think this is boring, because it's very niche. So, right, I went back to huge jump, quintupling of ransomware. tripling almost of business email compromise in terms of, and this is just the reported losses that we know about. There's many, many, many more where people just internalize it and they accept the risk and take the loss and don't report. So I do encourage anyone, please report. It's very important for government and for those of us in the cybersecurity community to get this data so we can identify potential trends that we can hopefully do something about.
So, Charisse, before you go in, what do you think the sort of reporting calculus is when we saw sort of some really egregious cases of not reporting and that resulting in criminal potential criminal liability?
Yeah, this is a tough one for us in the community, but it's a really excellent point. There's a big conversation, as you know, especially on ransomware. Do you pay or do you not pay? This ability to try to hide a vulnerability in terms of, oh, this is just really part of our vulnerability disclosure program. For those of you who don't know, we're probably talking about Joe over at Uber, who during an ongoing investigation made an internal decision, and I don't know him well enough to understand why people I know who know him say he's a good guy, made an internal decision to pay off a hacker and to hide a material breach. I think this is part of the reason, and Michael, you probably know better, the SEC has now been moving. They've got, rules that they're intending to promulgate for public companies, at least, where you're going to have to, there's going to be a materiality disclosure requirement for cyber incidents. Hopefully I don't know what that's supposed to do, honestly, and maybe hopefully we won't have these other internal shoots. I'm a transparency person. I always think that even if you're going to get a short-term black eye, it's better to acknowledge what's happened and, make an honest apology, try to understand what happened, try to remediate, try to remedy, and try to do better the next time. I don't think hide the ball and hiding information does the community or a company ultimately any good, because as Jax can tell us, that information is going to be out there on the dark web. Some threat intelligence software, some threat actor is going to find it and it will come out. Average duration between an incident and a remediation of a breach these days, it's still over 200 days. So it's a long time. People can find the information. If someone's determined, they'll find the information.
Let me ask Michael a question. Actually, you raised your hand, but let me ask you a question too. You're certainly free to respond to Charisse. NRG, if a data breach occurs, what happens internally in the decision-making process? When to disclose, how much to disclose? And related to that, since we have folks who will be listening who are both corporate counsel as well as outside counsel, what do you expect from your corporate counsel? What do you expect from your outside counsel?
So that answer is a complicated one, but not to evade it, but we actually practice this. So crisis management and business continuity is also one of the functions that reports up to me outside of the compliance context. We do tabletop exercises that involve a number of corporate functions. We did one in 2021 that was focused solely on a ransomware event. It lasted for 6 hours. It's run by the woman who runs crisis management for us. We have 174 business continuity plans across the enterprise. I would say we have gone from sort of nowhere to along the maturity scale on crisis management and business continuity over the last 6 years. So we have crisis management plans across the enterprise down to the sub function level. The answer to your question is embedded in probably half a dozen different crisis management plans who each have an element or a role to play in that kind of a circumstance. So legal has a role to play, the board has a role to play, cash management has a role to play, as does IT security and others. And that's set forth in individual crisis management plans and then reviewed each year and tested in tabletops. So we do at least one cybersecurity tabletop each year. We do 2 tabletops, but one of them is always going to be some element of cybersecurity.
And talking about role to play, what role does the in-house counsel have to play, and what role does the outside cybersecurity counsel have to play?
Yeah, I would say not. I'm no longer in the legal department. At one point in time, I was general counsel of the company, but now we have an excellent general counsel and legal department. Predominantly, I would say their role is advising on on payment, as I think it was Charisse that raised the issue of whether folks are going to pay. And if so, what are the ramifications of that? What are the state law elements, federal elements as well? How are we going to interact with the government in that respect? We have several governmental stakeholders in our multiple business lines that we would have accountability towards, and some sort of expectation on their part that we would be advising them. And then I think it's advice to the board of directors on, and to management on, what options there are. So I think both outside counsel and inside counsel would be answering, I think, those kinds of questions in an immediate, emergency situation.
Thanks. Jack?
I just wanted to start by giving you a gold star for having tabletop exercises. I'm so glad to hear that Energy does that. I just feel like everyone needs to do that. It's not having tabletops is the equivalent of not giving your employees the fire escape plan until there's a real fire.
And it's illuminating. It is
Yeah.
absolutely illuminating.
Yeah, and you can't make a decision on whether to pay a ransom if you don't know how long it takes to restore from backups, if you don't know the value of how each day of business loss is going to calculate. You have no leverage if you don't know the value of your own time. If you have backups, do you have backups that are offline? Do you have them that are actually up to date? Are you restoring from backups that are 6 months old? I mean, there's so many pieces of a tabletop that you learn when you're doing it. And the fact that you guys do a tabletop every year is just so awesome. I also just wanted to bring up that I do see clients that are reticent to report via IC3 to the FBI, and we have other clients where DHS or the FBI has alerted them. So here's what I explain to clients. The FBI has task forces, and when you make a complaint about a cyber event, a specific task force is assigned to review information about the event. So they are not going to be monitoring you as a client. They are going to be monitoring the Hive group or black cocaine or whatever it is. I'm sorry, there's an ambulance going by on my road right now. I think that it only helps to keep law enforcement apprised of what is going on with these events. And sometimes the FBI has a key, right, that they can decrypt, Diavol or whatever it might be. Sometimes the Secret Service can help claw back some of those lost funds if it's within a certain time period. So I just wanted to sort of boost the idea of these tabletops and doing incident response drills and keeping law enforcement part of it.
Thanks. Before we go to Christy, I just want to highlight to the panel that we have got 2 open questions there. So please have a look at the questions, and if you have responses, I'll invite you to respond to them after Christy intervenes. So Christy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was going to amplify what Jack said. Before my current time here and role at the CIA, I spent almost 10 years at the Justice Department and worked on what was known and what is known as the CISA, which is the Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015. And when companies do in fact share with FBI and or the Department of Homeland Security, one of the things that I think companies were reticent to share, one of the reasons was that they felt as though it was opening an investigation on their underlying activities, or that the FBI or DHS would inappropriately share that information. And what you find is individual rules from both the Attorney General as well as the Secretary of Homeland Security that really try to incentivize that threat cyber sharing back and forth, because and one of the sort of key issues in that debate was liability protection. And I think that there really should be sort of a shift in thinking in terms of how we share with FBI and DHS, because they're looking at sort of the threats, big picture threats, and may in fact be able to help companies either save money or reduce their overall liability by virtue of the fact that they are sharing that threat information.
Thanks, Christy. Charisse?
Yeah, I wanted to tie this all back in with the inside-outside counsel and cyber insurance. Then because there's been a rapid change in the industry over the last couple of years. And a couple of things for the corporate counsels and the outside counsels out there that you need to be aware of in the cyber insurance areas. Number one, sanctions. Ransomware payments, when you have to identify whether or not there's a sanctions, if the payment's being made to a potentially sanctioned entity. That's new. The second thing is you now have to pre-clear in most cases. If you're going to make a ransomware payment and then try to make an insurance cover claim, you have to get it pre-cleared. So back to your tabletops, how many of us have the direct phone number to our cyber insurance company or person in our tabletop, in our IR response plans? It's a gap I find common. It's a common gap I find. And then just to the step one for corporate counsels, if you think you may be at risk, or even if you don't, make sure that your outside counsel is vetted with your cyber insurer prior to an incident. Get it written in, and your forensics teams, get them written into your policies. When you're negotiating your policies, when you have the time to do that, when you're in the middle of an incident, it's too late to go back and say, oh, I really wanted CrowdStrike, or I really wanted Mandiant. I'm sorry, these are our approved vendors. And there's been a lot of, and I won't go into details here, but there's been a lot for corporate counsel. I do think you should ask someone to be very aware of the current privilege rules associated with forensics reports. There's a pretty substantial amount of case law on it from the Fifth Circuit as well as others. And it's important to know there are very specific steps that you have to take if you want to try to protect the results of a forensics analysis. And remember, facts are never protectable, and they're not protectable in the EU at all. But to the extent that your strategy or your remediations, you want to protect those as privileged, there's a very set of specific steps that you need to take.
Thanks.
Google them.
A question from the audience here asks about basically the searchability of things like facial recognition technology when they're used to create smart text for improving searchability of terms in the media. Will the images be converted into biometrics? How do you deal with this under GDPR? Does the panel have a thought on this?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the GDPR precludes non-consensual use of biometric data completely, and that would include facial recognition. Now, the difference between consent in the United States and the consent under the GDPR is if you, like I just went to Italy and all my new websites, now I've got like 15 things I have to go look at for every single website and turn them on or off. So the difference is that consent in the EU under the GDPR is much more proscriptive. So you do need to be aware that if you consent, then GDPR is off. So I think it really resolves around the consent issue.
Thanks.
I would just add for GDPR, just a couple quick thoughts is that, interestingly enough, in the GDPR, the national security apparatus claimed an exemption for themselves. It does not apply to the other nations' exemptions, but they did, interestingly enough, apply certain exemptions for themselves.
Thanks, Jack.
I am not licensed to practice in the UK, and I don't want to comment on the GDPR, but I just want to get back to this concept of user-based authentication, because we keep talking about biometrics and social security number as though each person has one identity, and the same human person can log in under a number of different roles in an organization. And hopefully they are not logging in as a domain administrator to perform user level functions. That's part of the concept of limited access. So I don't know if Trent, you have anything to add to this with, the software side of things, but I just think that we're thinking about identity. We're tying our digital identity to our human selves as we are one person. And especially in small businesses, the CEO might be the technologist, and that's fine for them to wear a lot of different hats. It's not just one person that's logging in to do the security piece. So I'm not trying to ignore the question. I just think there's another side of it.
Good.
Yeah. So as was mentioned, universities don't, I guess, spend as much money on IT as other places. So I have one identity at Penn State University, and when I was at IBM Research, I left in 2005 before this became as big a problem as it is now. But I wonder in businesses currently, if people are being asked to have multiple identities and choose amongst those. I know that when we looked at some government-based security mechanisms, there were issues with having multiple identities and not being able to get sort of it impeding your ability to do your work, kind of problems that seem to be bigger than we could deal with the technology that we had at the time. I don't know if that's an expectation now, that if you're a CEO and a technologist, that you have two different identities.
I want to take the discussion of multiple identities, the multiple objects. So one of the topics that Dan covers in his book is the idea that we are in the Internet of Things. And it's not just your fire alarm, it's your appliances that's connected to the internet. Potentially, it's things like pacemakers as well. So when things like these relate to health and safety issues, are we doing enough to certify the cybersecurity safety of these things that we use, that our lives depend on? And if not, what more can we do? Thoughts from the panel?
I have an opinion on this.
Yeah, go for it.
So when we had Conflicker and it shut down the surgical implements of GE surgical systems, one of the challenges was we couldn't get them patched because they were FDA approved, and the FDA, even to this day, I don't think has a really good mechanism for understanding patch management and of course they're running on Windows. Why you would build a real-time system on top of Windows, I don't know, but they were. So there's a disconnect sometimes, I think, between understanding the risk associated with connecting a device and the ability to manage that risk. And part of managing risk, we all know in cybersecurity, is patching. But if you have a regulated implement, if you have a regulated device, like a medical device, it's difficult to balance the safety and approval guidance from the FDA with a cybersecurity system. So I'm a huge fan of unconnected IoT devices. So they can be connected inside my infrastructure, but not outside. And an old apocryphal story, back when they were building the Boeing 747, I think it was. Originally, they were going to put the entertainment system on the same wired network as the control system in the cockpit. And we said, no, that's a bad idea. Please have, and they're like, oh, but it's going to be so much more expensive to wire things twice. And said, well, that's what you need to do.
And
think about that up front.
Are you seeing, Dan and others, in your experience, people imbibing the gospel that yes, it's more inconvenient, but especially if you're on a government entity or you're operating a 747, you really have to take the more inefficient solution, maybe the more costly solution, in order to safeguard your cybersecurity. Dan?
Yeah, I think that's the case, but I think ultimately, we're driving into a brick wall. And the only way we're really going to make headway is to have more systemic types of solutions. The internet is an architecture that was not designed for security. It's a woefully insecure thing. And so then we're building on top of it, trying to retrofit it for security, and it doesn't work well. It just doesn't. And, why do we have all the ransomware? Because it's easy to make transactions that you can't reverse, and they can do it because it's easy to do it. And the only way to stop it is to stop that. The only way to stop the fact that anyone can do this readily, with all the stop the ransomware kits. We have to do things at a more systematic level to try to hope that just all these organizations are going to get all their employees to be perfect at doing all the things they need to do for security. Is hoping that money is going to drop down from the sky. It's not going to happen. There's always going to be a lapse or a vulnerability. I'm not a technologist, but why does it have to be so easy for ransomware to encrypt everything? Maybe make it harder. Maybe make it harder, or design systems that are harder to exfiltrate the data and use those to help. There are, I think, structural things that we could look to do, and they might even be possible. I really don't know, but I just don't see anything, like enough being done that way. But those are ways that we could make some more headway in addressing this. It seems that I don't know how many cases I read where it just seems far too easy, for everything to get encrypted or everything to get exfiltrated. Then you get a double extortion type of situation. Far too easy to for the hackers to make these kind of financial transactions and get away with it. And if we start cracking down that way, maybe then we can start really making headway. But I just don't think we're not going to make much headway without doing something more systematically. We're just relying on each organization to kind of do its own thing on security. And the big rich ones are going to do better, but most of them don't have the money or the resources to really be able to pull that off.
Now, I want to talk about state actors, since we are running close to time. I think this is an important and timely issue. How far have we moved from state actor preparedness since incidents like SolarWinds, where Russia was allegedly involved, and the Marriott hackings, where China was allegedly involved in order to get information from US citizens, in particular government employees. 2022, we have Russia once again being seen as a threat to Western democracies, and the US and US citizens are once again in the crosshairs. So what should folks on this call know about state actors today?
Well, I mentioned before, I'll just say this from the perspective of being illuminated, I guess, into it. One of the metrics that we track, and that I will tell you that the board, when they see this twice a year, it never ceases to shock them, is the amount of attacks that we are under every second of every day. It's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of attacks all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it obviously, we don't have the ability to discern whether some, all, many, none are state actors, but I will tell you, it certainly heightens the senses when you see that kind of a number presented to you each and every time that that we report to the board. So it does. It just lends a level of seriousness to the discussion, at least at our company.
And how do you know if NRG's moat is broad enough, or its wall is high enough in order to deter or prevent intrusions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Daryl, and I don't have a good answer for you. I will leave that to the folks that run our data analytics and IT security functions, and who prepare those reports. We as members of the management team use all of those, but just like in any other situation, we have to trust that they are making that coming up with that analytical framework to make those decisions we then, use those decisions to try to help them. But yeah, I don't know. That's for the experts and the other experts on this panel.
Okay, other experts on this panel. What do you tell your clients?
I tell my clients to try to stay out of industries where they might be a target of a state actor. I don't deal much on the nation state level. My colleagues who do, basically are in a constant state of self-reassessment and analytics about it. That's defending is, you have to defend 100%. If you're attacking, you only have to find the 1%. Whether that's a technical vulnerability, as they found with SolarWinds, or a human vulnerability, as can happen, I think, in some organizations, especially customer service people who are well-meaning and sort of trained to help solve problems. I do think that there is, and I would look back to Trent on this. I do think there is an initiative right now around software bill of materials, having a little more sensitivity and understanding of the origin of the software that you're actually running, whether that's open source, having a good understanding of what you're utilizing in terms of open source, doing a little bit better job of validating and vetting the checksums out of GitHub. Sorry, these are technical terms. Sorry, but it's a reactive. I think we're being reactive there, and we're not necessarily being proactive. We really, I think in the implementation IT side, we depend on people in research to come up with better modalities to help us utilize tools, especially, software as a service, right? You mentioned ransomware as a service. Well, software as a service, back to the point about ransomware, what if you have how far do your tabletops go? If you have a third party that you're depending on to run private data center or a public data center, how much of their infrastructure are you depending on without actually testing it? A colleague of mine once said that a restore is just a piece of tape or a file until you actually put it back on a disk. Sorry, old terms. I guess it would go into SRAM nowadays. But it's, we have a faith-based approach to our IT infrastructure that if it ain't broke, don't test it, don't fix it. But that's not, if you're in a critical infrastructure, I don't think you can rely on that anymore. In fact, if you're anybody, you can't really rely on that anymore. But it's more inherent on us as knowledgeable attorneys to inform our teams about the potential risks, and for the organization to then decide if they want to accept or avoid that risk.
Thanks. Dan, you have a question for you in the Q&A section. Does Mr. Solov propose more governmental involvement and compromising encryption with respect to more systematic solutions? And who are we in that process?
Well, I mean, I think that, one government role that I think should not be done is, I definitely think, the proposals to mandate encryption backdoors are terrible. Definitely no. I think that, the law can require, that organizations use encryption and use good encryption. I don't know how many breaches I read about where data is not encrypted, including, login credentials, people's passwords. I mean, all these should be stored in encryption form. And this is not actually like some, small, dinky company. These are like big name companies storing passwords. And you just look through the FTC cases, for example, it's shocking just how derelict things are. So I think, really pushing on that, forcing that to be done can make a difference, can help. So there are a lot of things at the systematic level that could, push, greater, protection, and other things too that have nothing to do with, making, companies do different things. There are other types of solutions that can improve security for everyone, such as.
Then, so that I understand you correctly, are you saying that the government should not have the back door to encrypted devices, for example, with Apple and the
Yes,
iPhone.
absolutely. I think that's a security disaster. I think that creates a lot weaker security. These back doors are opening up vulnerabilities that can be exploited. That it's actually forcing security by insecurity by design.
And what do you that say to people that say, well, my kids were killed in this mass shooting, and we really want the government to get access to information so that they can bring the perpetrator to justice?
But there are costs to that. I mean, does that mean like, okay, because there was a terrible crime, the government should just be able to burst into everybody's houses without or install telescreens into people's homes? I mean, there are limits to what we say the government can do in its investigation, and government power does have limits, and we have those limits because we don't want a totalitarian surveillance society that oppresses people's freedom. And it's always a balance. And yes, if we had that and the government had a government official installed into everybody's house, yeah, we probably have less crime, and we'd probably be better at investigating it. But we don't like the trade-off. And I think the trade-off for the encryption backdoors is creating tremendous security vulnerabilities that I think will ultimately lead to more harm in the long run.
Thanks. Does anybody have a response to that?
I agree totally with what Dan just said. I think that's one way that opens a tremendous set of problems.
And there's an efficiency issue too. If people don't trust the ability to transfer data utilizing NIST certified encryption algorithms, then we end up with business inefficiencies. And that is, unfortunately, a consequence associated with trying to create backdoors. And I don't know if they exist or not. I don't have an answer to that.
Thanks, Jack. And then we'll do one round to close off the panel. Go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Sharice just said. I think that if you were to try, I think we should rely on things like the NIST framework rather than writing cybersecurity protocols into any sort of legal frameworks. So in that way, data security law doesn't fail, even though it puts too much emphasis on the breach. And all of this, data privacy is sort of the follow-up piece of the law. If we were to legislate encryption, we would have SHA 1 at this point, which is totally legacy, to try to keep up with something. The law is too slow. Like the law is too slow for technology. So I think we have to find other ways around this.
Thanks. Lots of food for thought. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to talk about one quick takeaway that audiences here should think about, either what has happened recently, what has happened a while ago, or what they should expect coming. You take your pick. Michael.
Wow. Okay. I would say the same things I mentioned before. Train your people, take it seriously, and crisis management and business continuity planning can't be you can't spend enough time on that. Do it as far down in the organization as you can stand it, and refresh it every year.
Thanks. Dan?
Well, I definitely agree with that point. And I definitely think, but we need the law to kind of help, push beyond that. So it's not just, every organization, for themselves. We need help. And when I say that the law can regulate things like encryption, I don't mean that the law should actually start specifying specific standards, but I think that the law can say something like using the strongest available standard, or a reasonable standard, and that more open-ended way of the law allows the law to evolve. And there are different good ways to write laws and bad ways to write laws. And I often see privacy and security laws written in ways that are too tethered to the particular technology of the day. But there are other laws and ways of writing them that really are able to evolve as technology evolves. And so it's craftsmanship in the law that really matters. And I do think there are a lot of things that the law can do that are not being done right now.
Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, I think, the the human element is such a big part of my job that a lot of people don't realize, and myself included. Sometimes I get really, a lot of ransomware is written in Rust, which is a new sort of innovative code that doesn't use headers, and a lot of encryption encrypts the headers. So that's why it's only a few megabytes and it happens really quickly. But, the technology piece is really interesting to me. But my clients are people who just lost their entire life savings and their business in one day, So it's very hard to balance how interesting I find this field with the fact that I'm in incident response, which means it's like triaging a crisis, and people are experiencing these horrible events. And I think that most of my clients leave the event more secure than where they started, if they still have their business. But I think if more people understood, especially corporate attorneys, if they saw more about the clients that I see, some of those conversations in the tabletops would be totally different. So this is something that happens all the time, every day. And I'm so glad we had this conversation today. I'd love to have more of them.
Thank you, Jack. Christy.
Yeah, one thing that just a takeaway that I think is important, and I think it underscores, when you think about cyber and breach, and you see some of the distinct asymmetry between what really expert folks understand and can talk about the actual technology. And as Dan mentioned, what you see the Hill attempting to do, we saw that very much with Cambridge Analytica. And you see sort of this disconnect between what the technology is and what the law, through the sausage making process ultimately winds up to be. I think long-term, one of the things that's going to be critical, not only in cyber, but if you look at privacy and civil liberties more generally, is understanding sort of the fact that civics and democracy and those sorts of courses that used to be present in schools, where now it's sort of 5 cents for every dollar spent for civics courses and 50 for STEM, right? So I do think that at least, one of my personal issues that I care about is making sure that sort of our population and our citizens understand how the government is supposed to work, and one segment of that is ultimately going to be technology. I think COVID was an accelerant to really bring some of these issues to the fore, but I do think that we need to educate more broadly society on a lot of these issues. Thank
you, Christy. Trent?
Thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had today. So I typically think about sort of a tripod where we have technology, we have sort of functional goals, or how people will work to solve their problems, and then we have the risks they face when they do it. And I guess in addition, we have what we've been discussing today, which is the law piece of how that may help bring these things together. I think especially with respect to computer security and probably computing in general, we're still at a pretty early stage technically of where we are with developing how we're going to use these systems and how we're going to use them to build systems that are secure. I guess I've been looking at some of these other technologies, like I mentioned earlier, like bridges, and I sometimes feel like we're in the Roman bridge stage of computer science. And so we still have a long way to go. But this is a very interesting discussion, and thanks for all your insights. And I think we're working on trying to bring these pieces together, but we still have a bit of ways to go.
Thanks, Trent. And Sharice, bring us home.
Yeah, so having just seen a 3rd century Roman aqueduct that's still working and delivering water, say the Romans were pretty good. I'm just going to leave you with one practical
tip. Rebuilt that though. But,
one practical tip. If you don't have single sign-on in your organization, please consider using a password manager and multi-factor authentication. And there are so many simple risks that can be avoided by that one step. Single sign-on's great, but it's hard. So take the baby step. Baby steps will lead to bigger steps, and then we'll all be more secure.
Thank you. Let's all learn to take baby steps today, make us all more secure. Well, please join me in thanking our panel, Michael Bremnick, Dan Solov, Jack Stryker, Trent Jagger, Christy Scott, and Charisse Castagnoli. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you all. And this video will be posted on YouTube in a few weeks, so we can have a rerun if you like. But thank you and good afternoon to all of you. Bye-bye.